Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Triangulation is brought to you by Cashfly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Triangulation, episode 119, recorded September 11th, 2013, of Dice and Men. Triangulation is brought to you by Lynda.com. Learn what you want when you want it, with access to over 2,000 high-quality online courses and training videos, all for one low monthly price. Try it free for 7 days. Visit lynda.com/triangulation. That's LYNDA.com/triangulation. And by Audible.com. To download the free audiobook of your choice, visit audiblepodcast.com/triangulation. It's time for Triangulation. Hello, everybody. Leo Laporte here. This is the show where we get interesting people, smart people who are doing stuff, and we get to sit down and spend some time with them, and I always love doing that. It's just a conversation. It's Triangulation because it's me, the guest, and you. In fact, we have, as always, hundreds of people in the chat room watching, and any questions you have, especially for this one, because I'm not an expert in the subject. David Ewalt is here. David M. Ewalt, the author. He's a Forbes columnist, reporter, covers gaming and hobbies, among other things, at Forbes.com and in the print magazine. And he's just released a new book, just came out August 20th, called, I love the name, of Dice and Men. It is a history of Dungeons and Dragons and the people who play it. David, thank you for joining me. You must be a D&D geek.
I am a D&D geek. Ever since I was a kid, I started playing when I was about 12 years old and stayed with it for a long time and just sort of rediscovered it in the last couple of years.
It feels like the kind of culture that if you were an outsider, you couldn't write about it. You wouldn't be allowed to.
Yeah, and it's a very geeky pastime for one, but also people get very into it. So they're very passionate about the hobby, and if you tried to fake your way around the topic, people would smell you out in a second.
I know, so I'm not going to try. I never played D&D. We were just talking, it really started, the first packaged D&D games, the first books came out in early 80s.
Well, 1974 was when it was first published, but it was very niche for a while. It didn't break until the early 80s.
Yeah, so I was out of high school in 73, so I think I missed out. Now, adults play D&D, but it seems to appeal, seems to me, primarily to teenage boys. Yes?
Well, historically, I think that's true. They were always the sweet spot, especially when the game was very big in the 1980s. It was real big around teenagers, and especially among boys. But the game has expanded beyond that, especially nowadays. You're seeing a real revival of it. There's a lot of nostalgia for it, and you're getting a lot of older gamers who are returning to it. So the demographics are changing.
So I'm going to plead ignorance. Describe for me what D&D is.
Well, I like to describe it as collaborative storytelling. I mean, the way to think about it is not to think of it like Monopoly. It's not about having a static board and just sort of traveling around and doing what the spaces tell you to do and taking a card and doing whatever that says. What you're doing is sitting down at a table with a bunch of friends and putting together a story with each other. It's a directed story. You have one guy who's the dungeon master, and he might be the person who creates a sort of basic plot line. He'll say, okay, you have to save this princess, or you have to kill this dragon. But then the players at the table are deciding how to do that sort of from their imagination. They're saying, well, my character's going to do this, his character's going to do that. The thing that separates it, though, from just plain make-believe is that it is mediated by rules and by dice. So there's a very strict rule system and a thing that turns it from just being sort of an improv exercise into a real game with a strong system behind it.
The Dungeon Master is paramount, though, to this. The ability of a Dungeon Master to come up with scenarios, to describe it in a way that engages the players. It seems to me that's a very important role.
Yeah, the Dungeon Master is very important. They're kind of like the director and screenwriter of a film all wrapped up into one. They're leading the story, and they're controlling people. You know, if you go into a city and there's villagers wandering around, if you decide to talk to one of the villagers, the dungeon master is going to be the person who plays that role and who moves you around through the city. So it's really important to have a dungeon master who knows how to tell a good story and who puts the work into each session to be prepared for you when you sit down at the table.
So it came out in 1974. Is that what they call the first edition?
Yes, the very first edition. It was published, very small printing in 1974. It came out of this community of wargamers, of guys who did historical miniatures war games, you know, where they would have like a table.
Those. Yeah.
Yeah, where you've got like the little figures of like, here's my infantrymen and here's my halberdiers, and they had been playing those games a lot and started experimenting with them and saying, well, we like these games, but what could we do differently about this? And somebody hit on the idea of, well, instead of controlling an entire army, what if I could just control an individual hero? And then because it was, you know, 1974 and Lord of the Rings was very big, Tolkien was very hot at the time, people very quickly took that idea of let me control an individual hero and turned it into, well, if I'm going to be an individual hero, I want to be Aragorn, or I want to be Conan the Barbarian. And it became this fantasy game of we're going to take these heroes and we're going to fight with swords and meet wizards and magical monsters.
And in fact, it was an insurance underwriter named Gary Gygax who was one of these, right? One of these miniature gamers who took it to the next level.
Yeah, Gary Gygax. The two guys whose names were on the first edition are Gary Gygax and David Arneson. Gary was a former insurance underwriter who was a really passionate gamer and actually decided he left his insurance job, took a part-time job cobbling shoes in his basement because he wanted to make games for a living.
I don't think there's a lot of business cobbling shoes, but maybe I'm wrong.
There's not. No, there's not, which is why it really put the pressure on him. Man, this game better work. He's lucky it did. Dave Arneson was kind of the same situation. He was a security guard, but these were guys who loved their games and were part of this experimental movement.
You say that the D&D community considers them basically the Lennon and McCartney of D&D. So what were their different roles? What did Gary do? What did Dave do?
Well, another analogy I like to use is kind of, you know, that they're sort of the Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Dave Arneson was sort of the engineer and the innovator. He was the guy who said, I'm going to figure out how to make this system work. Arneson was the guy who first came up with the idea of let's take our heroes and have them travel through a dungeon and fight monsters and really put it in that fantasy setting. Gygax was the visionary. He was the guy who saw this game and said, oh, there's a product here. I mean, he was a very passionate gamer too, but he was the guy who said, this is more than just a novelty. This is something that we can make into a phenomenon. And he is the guy who created the company and published the game and fought for years to get attention for it and made it an international phenomenon.
He passed away in 2009.
He did.
Arneson.
Arneson and Gygax both passed away within a year of each other.
Wow, wow.
Yeah.
So, you know, the miniatures continues. I mean, I played Warhammer with my kid, so that's still around. There was a fork in the road, and D&D took its own road. How did the game develop in the early 70s?
Well, out of these groups of wargamers, you know, one of the hot spots was kind of around the Great Lakes region, you know, where Gary Gygax was in a place called Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which is kind of a resort town outside of Chicago. And these people put this game together and experimented and invented this entirely new format for gaming. No one had ever seen a role-playing game before. This idea of, oh, I'm just going to be an individual hero. No game had ever done that before. And a lot else about the game was totally new and innovative too. So when they first published the product, it was a little slow to catch on just because people didn't really understand what it was. And having never seen a game like this before, you couldn't just buy the rules and read them and instantly get it. Like, you really needed to see people play it and get a feel for it. Within the first year of the game coming out, it sold about 1,000 copies, but it started growing exponentially after that. And, you know, within 3-4 years of it coming out, it was big within the wargaming community. People all over the country were playing it, but they were still that kind of niche gamer. And then I hit colleges, you know, because of the Tolkien connection, a lot of sort of science fiction and fantasy groups at colleges started playing it. And so it expanded out until it was very big among a certain community of people who were receptive to fantasy and gaming.
And you really have to give a lot of credit to these guys for really a lot of what gaming has become, not just table, pen, and paper-based gaming, but online gaming, video games. Gygax created the idea of leveling up. Gear that would boost your stats, the armor and the gloves and stuff. And the Dungeon Master was his idea. How did he come up with the idea of a Dungeon Master? That seems like a lot to ask of somebody.
It is. The roots of that actually go back a couple centuries ago to those war games, to the actual reenactments of historical battles. There were war games in the 15 and 1600s that got very, very complex, and it was actually used often by like members of the military to simulate battles and see, well, what'll happen if we attack the forces here? And those battles got so complicated that someone said, we can't do this anymore unless we have an impartial referee. We need somebody to stand here, and their only job is to solve rule disputes. And that idea is what some of these gamers up in the Great Lakes area hit on again after several centuries, and they said, we need an impartial referee. We need somebody to run this game, because otherwise it goes off a cliff.
Was this kind of an offshoot of chess?
It was, in a way. D&D having come out of war games, you trace the history of war games back, really all roads go to chess. Chess is really one of the first war games. Right. It's very abstract, but what chess is really doing is it's replicating an important historical battle in Indian history. And that's why you've got knights, you've got pawns. Those were the pieces that were actually on the board. The purpose of chess, though, wasn't to strictly simulate the same battle and to say, well, here are the hills and here's the infantry charge. It was to teach a critical lesson about that battle. Chess is really about space and about owning the board. And so that game, the lesson of that for military people was, you don't necessarily win a war by killing another soldier. You win it by controlling the battlefield.
Were Arneson and Gygax designing for kids? Who were they designing for?
They were initially designing for other wargamers, which really at the time when they first started the game together, it was mostly people who were college age and older. A lot of them were older. There was a lot of vets. People had come out of the Second World War, came back to the U.S. and got involved in these historical miniatures battles. But over time, when the game broke, in the early 80s, it bled out of the wargaming communities and became huge. It was in toy stores. Kids had their hands on it everywhere. And at that point, D&D was very, very definitely being designed for a mass audience and for kids quite often.
I remember very well going into comic book stores, and there'd be a room in the back, and you kind of peer through the door, and there'd be all these guys sitting around a table, and they, oh yeah, they're playing D&D. Yeah. It was very, when it took off, it became very, very popular. And that was about when? Early 80s? 10 years later?
Yeah, well, the key moment was in late 1979. This game, so it was really at that point, is just on college campuses. And what happened, there was a kid who was really like, he was a genius. He graduated from high school at 16 and went straight off to college. But as often happens with kids like that, he was kind of alienated. He didn't have a ton of friends. And when he got to college, he started to make some friends among the college students who played Dungeons and Dragons. Then what happened with him is he unfortunately suffered a bout of depression. He ran away from school. And when that happened, his parents and the school administration went to his dorm room to try and figure out, well, what happened to this kid? And all they found were these weird game books that had pictures of demons and dragons on them. So that was the story that they went to the press with of,
I remember that. It was associated with Satanism. Exactly. It was suicide. People thought that kids were fleeing reality playing this game and ending up going crazy.
Because no one had ever seen a game like this before. And if it was brand new to you, you pick it up and there's like, there's a list of spells here and pictures of demons. Oh, it's satanic. Right. But that made it national news. And you can imagine as soon as there was a national news story out there saying, hey, there is a crazy satanic game that is so powerful to make you lose your mind.
That was good for it.
Everybody wanted to play the game after that. Yeah,
how funny. Describe. So, was this the first edition still, or had they gone to a second edition by now?
Well, by that time, by 1979, they were working on a new edition, but it was still the original.
Still the original one. Okay. Describe in the early days what a game might look like. I have an image here. There's a playing map. People have drawn onto the playing map the dungeon that they're in. And this one has not only multi-sided dice, but they've actually got figurines, kind of those war game style figurines. Were those typical? Is this a fairly typical looking setup?
That's a fairly common setup, but a lot of those early games would look unfamiliar to today's gamers. When Gary Gygax ran his games, and he did frequently, I mean, he played the game and ran it for people all the time.
He was a dungeon master.
He was a dungeon master. And when he would run the game, he had people come into his basement. He would sit at his desk, and he had a filing cabinet next to him, and he would pull all the drawers out so he could hide behind them. And the players would sit at a table on the other side of the room, so they couldn't see him. And all they would do is they would have to listen very carefully for the sound of his voice coming from behind the filing cabinet.
Oh, that's great.
So it set this weird sense of drama. And today, I mean, I've never sit at a game where the dungeon master is not at the table, but that's the way that Gary ran it. And he also didn't use figures. He very rarely used them. He didn't draw players' maps. It was very much on the players to keep track of everything themselves, listen very carefully, and run the game on their end.
Give me an example of what he might have said and what the play would be like.
Gary's games very frequently were in a place called Greyhawk. He designed this castle Greyhawk and this little city around it. It was a medieval city, and underneath the castle there were these warrens full of monsters. And so a typical game might be a group of players show up. They were all kind of mercenary. It wasn't the same group of players every single time, but the idea was that they were going to go into these dungeons and explore and kill monsters and find treasure. And so he might tell them, okay, you've walked into a room and there's a chest on the far end of the room and there's nothing else in here. And then it comes onto the players to be like, well, am I going to walk up to the chest and just try to open it? Knowing Gary Gygax, there is probably some sort of evil trap here. And so there'd be a back and forth like that. The player might go, all right, I'm going to go check the chest for traps. And Gary inevitably would roll some dice and tell them whether or not the trap exploded in their face and killed them.
Does he have in his mind the whole layout ahead of time? He's not making this up. He's not deciding to create a trap as soon as the player moves into that space.
In those games, he mostly designed it ahead of time. Like he would map out.
He'd know what they were facing.
He would know what was in each room. He would know what the map looked like. The players didn't, but Gary always knew sort of what was in the next room. Now, the trick there is that even though he had planned ahead, you never know what your players are going to do. Gary might have said, okay, this time they're going to walk into a room. There's going to be 12 goblins there, and they're going to fight them. What if the players get to the door of that room and decide, I don't like the looks of this. I'm not even going to go through the door. I'm turning around. I'm going back to town. I'm having a beer. So Gary would have to roll with that, and he would have to tell the story. And that's a problem every dungeon master faces now is when players don't want to go the direction that you are trying to lead them, you still have to
well, that's dumb. You know, come on, players. You're playing the game here. Let's make it interesting. It does remind me a little bit, they're saying in the chat room, of the old Infocom adventures like Zork and even its predecessors, Colossal Cave. And those text adventures. It sounds very similar. Were text adventures influencing Gygax and Arneson, or were Arneson and Gygax influencing text adventures?
Those early text adventures were almost invariably inspired by Dungeons and Dragons.
So I guess I did play, because I spent hours playing the original Colossal Cave and then Zork and all of the rest.
A lot of those games were started because people who played Dungeons and Dragons a lot, you need friends. You need people at a table. You need to get everybody in one place. And if you can't get all your friends together because they're working or they're in class or something like that, you can't play Dungeons and Dragons. So a lot of those people, computer-minded fans, were like, well, I'm going to code my own Dungeons and Dragons. I'm going to make a version that I can play even when I don't have my friends around to play the game with them.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah.
How interesting. We're talking about Dungeons and Dragons with David Ewalt. He writes for Forbes, writes about games for Forbes. What an the business of games. That's how they make it okay. What an interesting job. His latest book, it just came out in August, of Dice and Men, is really a history of Dungeons and Dragons going back to Gygax and Arneson. and all of that. You know, I interviewed some time ago, and I consider him a friend, Daniel Suarez, the author of Freedom, and well, he's got a whole bunch of books now. Say again? Damon was the first one, then Freedom TM, and then he has the new one. But he said he became a novelist because he was a dungeon master. 3rd edition D&D. He ran a dungeon for a long time. It was, he said, one of the highlights of his young adult life and teenage life. And it was that storytelling, that need to create a story to engage his players, to keep them moving along, that helped him develop his storytelling skills. And he's become a very, very successful novelist as a result.
That's a story I've heard that from a number of different authors. Is that because it's storytelling boot camp?
Exactly.
A lot of novelists, guys like Neil Stephenson played D&D when he was in college. Lev Grossman and Austin Grossman, Ernest Cline. These are all guys who played a lot of D&D when they were young. Makes
a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. By the way, the book is, somebody's asking in the chat room, is it on Audible? Yes, it is on Audible. So there's a Kindle version, there's hardcover paperback, and there's also Audible. And in fact, I'm going to make that my next Audible pick for sure. In fact, let's take a break and do it right now. Our show today brought to you by Audible.com. Audible, of course, is the place we talk about all the time for great audiobooks. Now 150,000 strong. Daniel Suarez's books are there. A lot of great books are there. But if you're interested in Dungeons and Dragons of Dice and Men is also there. And I'm going to tell you how you can get it for free. If you visit audiblepodcast.com/triangulation, you're going to sign up for the gold account. That's the book a month account. But your first 30 days are free. Download the book, enjoy it, listen. If you decide not to renew, don't just cancel in the first 30 days. That book is going to be yours forever. I don't think you're going to ever quit. I see you narrated this, or at least you did part of it, huh?
I did. One of the sort of narrative devices I use in the book is I had to go play the game and talk about the game, but it's boring to say, I roll a die, this guy roll a die. So I kind of, so part of the games that I played in, I sort of wrote up as fantasy fiction. And the Audible book is awesome because I read sort of the narrator parts, and there's a professional, this guy, Mikhail Naramore, who does fantasy fiction books. He narrates all those in-game parts of the books. It's a really cool audiobook. It's definitely worth checking out.
Oh, it sounds like you should get the audiobook. What fun. You really can get experience of what it sounds like to be in a D&D game. Makes me want to... can I still play D&D? I mean, can I go out and do it?
Oh, yeah. The game is having a revival right now. There's a new version coming out probably early next year, but there's also lots of opportunities to play it. Conventions, game conventions, there's always D&D games. I was at PAX a couple weeks ago at the Penny Arcade Expo. They had D&D there.
Oh, that's neat.
And the current publishers of the game have a weekly program every Wednesday night at game stores and comic book stores around the country where you can go and play.
So visit audiblepodcast.com/triangulation. Sign up for the gold account. Get your credit. I mean, there's lots of choices. Of course, there's David's book of Dice and Men, but there's also great science fiction. There's history. I listen to a lot of history, a lot of biography. I'm about to leave for Venice. I got a history of Venice. I love to listen as I walk through a town, listen to books about the town. It really brings the history to life. If you spend time in the car, if you've got a long commute, Audible's a lifesaver. But I do it at the gym because it's so boring to be on the treadmill. Not when I got a great audiobook, walking the dog, making the bed, doing the dishes. Basically, I got Audible on all the time. I want you to try it. audiblepodcast.com/triangulation. Sign up for the gold account. Your first book is free. This would be a great choice. Of Dice and Men, the story of Dungeons and Dragons and the people who play it. David M. Ewalt is our guest on Triangulation today. So when did they? When did Gygax and Arneson? Did they ever move on? Wizards of the Coast bought it, right?
Right. So Gygax and Arneson worked together on the game for a while, and there's an interesting business story here too. Aside from just the coolness of the game, we're so familiar with sort of Silicon Valley success stories of like some guys build software or build a piece of technology in a garage in Palo Alto. This was a very similar environment when these guys built this game. It was a real startup environment. But the story here is what can go wrong when you don't really know how to run a business at all.
Oh boy.
The company TSR that published Dungeons and Dragons got very rich. By the early and mid 1980s, they were making tens of millions of dollars a year. It was the Oh yeah, it was the fastest growing game in the country. They were looked at very seriously by big toy companies and publishers of like, this is not only should we try and do our own game like this, but this is a real threat to us. But with all that money coming in, these guys didn't know what to do with it, and so I tell some stories in the book about the things that they thought about spending the money on. I mean, these guys they bought a needlework company.
What?
Yeah, a needlework company, so that you could buy needlework patterns and like it would be like a dragon. It was official Dungeons and Dragons themed needlework kits.
Why not?
They even debated buying a railroad.
What?
With the logic being, so Lake Geneva, Wisconsin was an old resort town, and there was an unused railroad track going from Chicago to Lake Geneva. And so the logic being, well, what if we bought the railroad and ran game trains where you would get on at Chicago? It would be fun, but it's not really a very sound business at the cost of running a railroad. So TSR eventually ran into some really significant financial troubles, and Gary Gygax was forced out.
Oh.
It was purchased by a woman who was the heir to the Buck Rogers fortune. Her grandfather was the guy who first published Buck Rogers and had all the money from the syndication of that. And years later, the company ran into more trouble and was eventually sold to Wizards of the Coast.
I guess it kind of makes sense if you're living in that kind of fantasy world and you suddenly come into a lot of money. Of course, you're going to buy a needlework company, a train company. I'm surprised they didn't buy a castle.
Yeah.
And make Nighthawk somewhere in the real world, right?
They did have a kind of like a castle on the Isle of Man that the company owned.
Of course they did.
Because these were idea men, they were super imaginative. They had, all these big ideas, and they were big on fantasy.
Sure.
So, yeah, but that's not necessarily the best way to run a business.
No, but what's the point of becoming a great, entrepreneur in Dungeons & Dragons if you can't buy a gosh darn castle? That's true. That's what I say. So, yeah, how far did they take it? I mean, when did Gygax and Arneson kind of pass the torch? When was that? What year was that they sold it to the Buck Rogers lady?
86, I think.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so it was the mid-'80s.
They really only did it for maybe 10 years.
Yeah, and Arneson was actually at the company for an even shorter period of time. He and Gygax, once they started working together full-time, had a lot of personality differences. They ended up suing each other.
Oh.
Arneson sued the company back and forth, and there was a lot of conflict there, sort of part of it being, well, who really invented this game, but also who should get what part of the monies that now this game is making. But yeah, by the mid-'80s, the company was sold off to another entrepreneur, and was where she ran it until the late '90s when Wizards of the Coast bought it.
It was 1985 that 60 Minutes did this report.
So basically, we interviewed.
Oops, hold on a second. I got something else running on a tab here somewhere. Let me make sure all my tabs are closed. How dare I have something else running? I think it's probably the interview with those guys. Here we go. Let's try it again. Ed Bradley. This is what you were talking about when people decided Dungeons and Dragons was going to.
It's become popular with children anywhere from grammar school on up. Not so with a lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders. The idea of the game, which is played by highly imaginative and intelligent kids, is to assume the role of one of the characters. One game can go on for weeks or even months. The problem seems to be that some kids take it more seriously than others, take it a step further, playing a character who brings them the power in a game they couldn't possibly get in real life.
Oh, come on.
About 2 months ago, a green eyeball was seen up in the sky. This eyeball was so big it blotted out the sun, okay?
These young people are playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Is there any truth to this? Did kids become so obsessed that they didn't eat? Did anybody really suffer breakdowns because of playing too much D&D?
No, not really. I mean, there is a grain of truth in as much as that this game is very engrossing. It's not like, a board game in that you're sort of, this is my piece. You're projecting yourself into the character.
Right.
You're giving that character emotional drive, you're giving it motivation, and so you start to identify with your character. That's why it's so much fun, because you get this sort of vicarious thrill. It's not just a piece of paper fighting a monster. You're fighting a monster. Now, that said, there are plenty of people who probably spent too much time playing the game. There's probably a lot of college students during the heyday that failed some exams because they were playing too much D&D.
Yeah, well, Bill Gates played too much bridge in college, okay?
Exactly, right?
Stephen King played hearts too much in college. This is what you do in college.
Yeah, right. And this is a great way, too. This is a good thing, in a sense, to do too much of, because you are still exercising your brain.
Right.
It's creative and it's smart. But nobody went crazy. Nobody killed their parents. But, the media really hooked on that idea. And there was a period there, and this is kind of what you're seeing in that 60 Minutes piece, where anytime a crime was committed, when the police would go and if they would discover, like, oh, the kid has, or the adult has D&D rule books, that was the story. It was sort of like they'd found drugs, or they had found, guns in his house. And we found Dungeons and Dragons manuals. Clearly, this is another D&D related crime.
But the same exact, and the reason I bring this up is we're hearing the same exact things now about World of Warcraft and video games, and video games making kids violent. And anytime there's a school shooting, that's the same thing. They go look for the video games, and I think it's just as equally specious.
Yeah, the thing that really D&D sort of peaked at the end of the 1980s, but the idea that the game was satanic and dangerous really only sort of faded into the background when it was replaced by video games, the Columbine shootings. And that's suddenly, now we're going to blame video games. We don't worry about D&D anymore.
We always need a boogeyman somewhere in this. This is so much fun. It makes me want to play, and I guess that's probably I'm not alone in that. I know the chat room's saying the same thing. We're talking with David M. Ewalt. His book of Dice and Men is the story of Dungeons and Dragons and the people who play it. So let's fast forward out of the bad old 80s. The Wizards of the Coast bought it in 1994, and somewhat commercialized it, yeah?
Well, so Wizards bought it, by the time they stepped in, the game had been largely replaced by video games. Were starting to catch on really big at that point. Wizards of the Coast had all its money because it was the publisher of Magic the Gathering, the card game, which was making a lot of money. So they bought D&D sort of as, a second product. It was Magic the Gathering that paid their bills. And what they did that was smart and that helped bring it back was their first version, their edition of the rules that they published, they open sourced it. It was inspired by Linux and by other open source movements. And what they did is they said, here's the core rule set. We're releasing these rules to the world under an open source license. So anyone who wants to can write rules that plug into this. If you think that there should be rules for fighting underwater, write those rules yourself, and they'll be semi-official. You have our license to go and add on to the game. And by doing that, it really brought people back into the hobby, because suddenly there was this influx. I mean, it was all these developers around the world that Wizards of the Coast didn't have those resources, but now they had people all over the world writing the game for them.
What an inspired move. What a good move.
It's a really great idea, and it was a great period of experimentation in the games industry.
But I think you pointed to this. As computers started to become more and more popular, that took a little bit of a toll on D&D.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple reasons. Video games don't require an event. You don't have to get 6 people together in a room. You can sit down anytime and play a video game. And also, video games, it's easier in a sense. You're getting the story told for you. You have, the nice high-definition graphics in front of you. And so when that was a novelty, when video games first started being 3D and much more interactive, and when they went online with things like Warcraft, like tons of people who played Dungeons and Dragons just completely defected from that world and went and started playing video games.
And that's a shame in many ways, because one of the things that's great about D&D is you use your imagination. You are creating your own world, and it is social. I mean, if people were worried about kids spending weeks in the back room at a comic book shop, what about the kid who's spending, his entire life sitting in front of a TV screen all by himself?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why gamers are starting to return to Dungeons and Dragons, and also why people who grew up playing video games are now playing D&D for the first time, is because they're like, oh, wow, I get a social event out of this. This is something I'm not used to when I'm playing other games.
So D&D is far from dead. We're currently on the 4th edition of D&D, but they're working on 5.
Yes, Wizards of the Coast has been sort of following the tech model again, they released a beta of a new set of rules just over a year ago. They're calling it D&D Next. And they're doing this long beta program where anybody who wants to can go to these stores, go to game stores and play it there, or just download the rules. And so they're beta testing the game for a year and a half, and presumably will come out with a new version with D&D 5.0 sometime early next year.
What changes from? I don't understand.
Right.
I mean.
There's a couple things. One thing that changes is you can start by looking at this from a business perspective. If I'm a publisher and I publish a set of rules and say, here's your game, well, you bought the rules. I can't sell you anything anymore.
Right.
So one of the reasons why there have been multiple editions is because the publisher realized, well, we can get people to buy the game again if we change the rules and tell them it's different now. You need the new rules. So that's one of the things. They've just changed it sort of sometimes arbitrarily to get people to buy the new edition. But they also make changes to sort of reflect what's popular in the gaming world. 4th edition, which is the version that came out now, some people love it, other people hate it because it's often thought of as more video gamey. When they designed that edition at the time, they simplified it a lot, and it sort of has more the feel of a World of Warcraft. You've got a set list of powers, and you can sort of click the button on that power and use it over and over again. Some people like that, other people don't. But every edition, there's sort of a different feel to it, and a slightly different approach.
So there would be a reason to upgrade. Are there also in the early days, of course, you had to find 20-sided dice. You could buy these at game stores and so forth. Nowadays, do people use? I mean, you could find apps on any smartphone that have every dice design possible.
Oh yeah, well, people still use the dice just because they're fun to play with.
It's old-fashioned. It's physical. Yeah.
But
So do they make money on dice? They make money on action figures. What else do they?
Wizards of the Coast mostly makes their money off of the rules and increasingly off of branding. So Wizards of the Coast got bought by Hasbro. And now what Hasbro spent the last couple of years doing is gathering together all the rights to different things. TSR, the company which first published D&D, sold off the movie rights years ago, and the game rights and the merchandise rights. Hasbro's got all those back now, and I think a big focus for them is like, there's going to be a new D&D movie. There might be a D&D TV show. There's going to be more D&D video games. So that's going to be a big thing.
There was a crappy TV show, I remember, right?
There was a Saturday morning cartoon.
Yeah.
Which was not of the highest quality, but I can imagine saying that it's crappy. There are definitely some people that you have angered right there.
Oh, really? No, come on. Really?
It was cheesy. It was cheesy, but there's people who are very passionate about it.
Yeah, Carter F says, it rocked!
Yeah, people were very passionate about it. Because if you were a little kid and you were into D&D, and suddenly there was a D&D cartoon, that was the best thing in the world.
Yeah, yeah. How close was it to actual D&D? I mean, it wasn't. It wasn't. They had the name.
It was a sort of same fantasy setting, but it didn't really resemble the game in any significant way. It was just, it was closer to watching Conan the Barbarian or Lady Hawk or some other sort of fantasy film of that era.
It looks a little bit like Scooby-Doo, actually, as I'm watching.
Quality of the animation was not great.
Is there audio on this, John?
Where are we? Look out!
Okay, you can't tell me this is great.
Ranger?
I guess if you're a kid and you watch this,
magician,
you'd be nostalgic about it.
Yeah. They re-released all the cartoons on DVD about 2 years ago, and if anybody's really nostalgic for this cartoon, I don't know if I would recommend them go back and watch it, because they don't really stand up too well.
It's going to ruin your childhood is what it's going to do.
That was Venger, the force of evil.
Get ready, because it sounds like the rights to these have been sold, and they're going to be back.
Yeah, I would.
Will they be a full action? I mean, live action.
I think the sweet spot is probably a movie and maybe a TV show. There have been 2 D&D movies, but they were both garbage, and one of them was direct to video. The other one is just classic camp, really, really bad.
But if you saw Conan the I mean, there were so many D&D influenced products.
Oh, yeah.
And if you play World of Warcraft, that's obviously D&D influenced. Conan the Barbarian movies. I mean, the Clash of the Titans. These are all influenced, heavily influenced by D&D.
Very much so. A lot of people in film and TV played D&D when they were young. Not only, it's also that thing where they say this taught me to tell a story, but it's also what got them into fantasy.
Yeah.
People like Jon Favreau, who made the Iron Man films. He played D&D. He was the dungeon master, and he said, "Yeah, this made me want to make fantastic movies and tell these kinds of stories."
Oh, that's really neat.
Yeah.
Do you have all your old? Do you have your old D&D games, the game boards and stuff like that? Did you save them?
I have a lot of them. I have the character sheets. When you're making your character, I kept all my character sheets. I went through a period when I stopped playing. When I went off to, I played D&D and other role-playing games in elementary school, and then through high school. And then when I went off to college, I decided I was going to reinvent myself, and I said, "All right, I'm not going to play this anymore." Yeah. And I actually sold off some of my classic old D&D manuals for beer money, basically, when I was in college. And those books are now highly collectible. So if someone's got original D&D books somewhere in an attic or in your parents' basement, some of those books are worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars.
No, really?
Yeah. Oh, if you have the original, like brown box, those go for a couple $1,000s sometimes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. It's shocking.
All right, got to start looking through the attic, everybody.
Yeah.
We're talking with David Ewalt. He's the author of Dice and Men, a columnist at Forbes.com and in the magazine. He writes about the gaming business. Actually, I'm going to ask you about other games, too. Xbox One or PlayStation 4?
I think the PlayStation has got Xbox beat right now.
That's the one people are buying, apparently. They've sold over 1 million of them.
And I've been talking to a lot of developers and people at different publishers, and they seem more excited about the PlayStation. It's way more powerful. I think we're going to see a lot more innovative games. At least at the first, we're going to see bigger and more shocking games on PlayStation than we will on Xbox.
Uh-oh. We'll talk more about that. Hold on. Save that thought. I want to, because I already ordered one, but I don't want to tell you which one. Our show today brought to you by Lynda.com. I know Lynda. I know Lynda. We go way back. Linda Wyman used to come on the Screensavers on a regular basis. She wrote a series of fabulous books for web developers and designers. She always was the best teacher. You could learn how to use technology with Linda Wyman. And she created Lynda.com, I think about 10 years ago, something like that. And it has just grown and has become the best online resource for learning how to use technology. Over 2,000 courses, tens of thousands of videos. I love how she does it. Instead of buying an individual course or an individual video, you just pay a monthly subscription and you have access to everything. And because Lynda.com is so rich, that is the way you want to do it. It's not just software, although I think a lot of, our staff will have them go there for Final Cut training because that's what we use a lot of. Lisa's working on Excel, learning. She's already an Excel expert, learning more about pivot tables, things like that. I also they have some soft skills. They have business skills as well, building a resume, how to negotiate, how to manage your time. What's great about Lynda, up and running with Link Online. Look at that. We're actually looking I should probably watch this. I'm actually I've been watching the Lightroom 5 stuff because I wanted to get up to speed on Lightroom 5. Facebook for musicians and bands. Social media basics for musicians and bands. Office for educators. Let's take this as an example and just show you what you get. So, of course, they take these videos and they divide them up. So it's very easy to find. There's Lynda. Very easy to find the subject matter you want. But here's what Lynda.com does differently from just going on to YouTube and finding some video there. State-of-the-art studios, curated course content, and I love this. They've got the exercise files, so you can download those, work along with the instructor, and this is something totally unique, a text transcript. So you can actually search the transcript for what you're trying to learn and go right to that particular section of the video. They've got the time codes all the way through this. It is so slick. You can watch on your computer, of course, but also on your tablet or your mobile device, even switch back and forth and, of course, pick up where you left off. I just think lynda.com is a great way to learn stuff, whether it's for your business or for fun. Photography courses. I should mention, maybe a little disclaimer here, I happen to know a lot of the instructors, especially in the photography arena. Deke McClelland, Bert Monroy teaches Photoshop, Pixel Playground. Ben Long is a good friend of mine. Derek Story, he's been on our show. Scott Bourne, up and running with Micro Four Thirds cameras. So I have a little bit of a bias here. I am such a fan of lynda.com, and so many of the people I work with do videos for them. We've got a special deal for you. Normally, it's $25 a month for access to the entire course library. For $37.50 a month, you get the premium plan, which includes exercise files, so you can follow along with the instructor's project. You set the pace. With mobile access, you can learn whenever you've got a free minute or two. But our special deal is 7 days, the whole place, free. If you don't take advantage of this, you're missing the boat. At least find out what lynda.com can do for you. Visit lynda.com/triangulation and sign up for your free 7-day trial of lynda.com. If you want to know what Bert Monroy's doing these days, if you want to keep up in all of these areas, Bert's got a great thing there. Scott Bourne and Richard Harrington are on lynda.com. Lynda's the greatest. Lynda.com, great-looking videos in every subject. Are you ready to learn today? Get learning with Lynda. Hi, Lynda. Lynda.com/triangulation. We're talking to David Ewalt. So I bought the Xbox One. At least I pre-ordered it. It's coming in November. 1 week earlier, of course, the PlayStation 4. You think the PlayStation 4 is going to be the one to beat, huh?
I think so. I mean, they're both going to sell huge, but the PlayStation, it's set up nicely to be the leader of this generation.
Yeah. And I guess does this come down to, just as it does on computers, to developers, to people embracing it?
It's you know, the most important thing is which console is going to have the games that people want to play. And right now, the developers I talk to are more excited about PlayStation.
It did used to be about exclusives, but I don't think either platform has a ton of exclusives. Most big game companies want, you know, BioShock, I could get it in 18 different formats.
Yeah, exclusives are less important. I mean, there always are, you know, one game that comes out for the other platform. It's inevitably the game you want to play the most is for the game platform you don't have.
Right.
But yeah, if you're a AAA game publisher, you want as many customers as possible. You want to also port the thing, the Wii, and onto PCs, and make a Facebook version. You want it everywhere. How important is standalone gaming now, though? Isn't mobile gaming and casual gaming just eating it up? It's not. I think it's complementary. Mobile and casual is where huge amounts of money are, and that's where the growth is. But the console standalone PC isn't going away. That's still growing. And you know, things like PC gaming is coming back hard because of large part because of Steam. Steam is amazing, yeah. You know, so those standalone games and those communities built around that are still, you know, very much a going concern, and there's a lot of money, a lot of growth there. Yeah. Although you look at things like iPhone sales, and it, you know, I mean, compared to Xbox, or actually lump Xbox, PS, PlayStation, and Wii together, and it still is dwarfed by iPhone sales alone. Yeah. Well, I think it's good because everyone is a gamer now, because everybody has a smartphone, or everybody's on Facebook and they've got access to those games. You know, we've got grandmas who are playing a little Candy Crush. You know, and they're they're addicted. Exactly, right. So the market has expanded out so much that I think more and more people are going to start to come into other kinds of gaming. You know, you're going to have grandma say, "Boy, I really like this game so much. Maybe I'm going to try it on my computer." I should try Call of Duty. I bet you that'd be fun. You know, we saw with the Nintendo Wii how much that expanded. I mean, they set up Wiis in nursing homes. You know, so there really is. It's not too hard to imagine consoles expanding out to new audiences. So gaming, you know, gaming, which has had ebbs and flows. I remember after the Atari era, it was just crash. Right? It was over. And I bought a Jaguar, I bought a 3DO, I bought all, you're probably even too young to remember those, the Lynx, all of these crap platforms that never went anywhere, and I thought gaming is dead. Obviously I was wrong, and it's partly because of Sony, but mostly because of Nintendo, Sega, which late lamented, Yeah.
And then along comes Microsoft with the Xbox and now the Xbox One.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting new way that they expand tunes now, because these game consoles are not just games. You know, I say that the PlayStation 4 has the advantage, I think, when it comes to games, but the Xbox is a really phenomenal media box.
Media box, yeah.
And I think when people see that, like in their neighbor's living room, you'll see people buying an Xbox just because they want all the media stuff.
How important is Kinect to this equation? I mean, that's something, Sony's got the Move, but Kinect really is unique.
Yeah. There's some really cool stuff with Kinect. I mean, when they try to shoehorn it into games, I think that's where Microsoft runs into trouble. But there was some interesting experiments. Like last year, they came out with, Microsoft did a game with Sesame Workshop, the company that does Sesame Street. And they released an interactive version of Sesame Street. And so the kids who are watching Sesame Street can use the Kinect camera to interact with Elmo. He hears them talk and he talks back. And you can wave at the screen and Cookie Monster waves back at you. And there are interactive games that you play with the Sesame Street characters. I think things like that, where they start from scratch and they build something interesting around it. And there's that Kinect's really promising there.
Kinect native games.
Yeah. Not just when you take some shooter and say, oh, you can also use Kinect to put your gun together. It's just, no.
No fun.
Yeah.
Can people play D&D on computers? Is it possible? It's not the same, is it?
It's not the same, but there has been a couple of tools that have come out in the past few years. I know people, for one, that play D&D over with their friends, all in different cities. They basically video conference. They use things like, they use Google's video conferencing tools. They do Hangouts together. And there's a few sites. There's a great site, like, for instance, it's called D20. And it's an online tabletop. So if you want to have your map and have your figures, everybody can log into the site and they can play the game together online. There's a lot of people who are playing it that way now.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's kind of cool. Hey, David, I thank you so much for being here. It makes me want to play D&D. So can I just go down to the comic book shop? You think there's somebody in the back room there?
Almost always, yeah. Or at the next con you go to. Tech cons, there's always a hotel room somewhere where the nerds have gathered and they're playing D&D.
How do they feel about newcomers who go, well, what do I do next now? What happens?
Actually, they love them because
Really?
you can never have too many players. That's the limiting factor for D&D, is whether or not you can get enough people. So you will be welcomed.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody having a D&D game, just let me know. I'll come right over. David Ewalt's book just came out in August, and I think it's if you want to kind of get the bug, this is the way to do it. He's got in here, which is great passages, as he mentioned on the Audible book, but there's passages in the book where he really kind of sets a scenario, and you can kind of live it at the same time as you're reading about the history of it and everything. It's called Of Dice and Men, perhaps the best title ever. You were lucky you snagged that one.
Yeah.
The Story of Dungeons and Dragons and the people who play it, from Scribner. Thank you, David. Really nice to talk to you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Appreciate it. Of Dice and Men. We do Triangulation every Wednesday afternoon, about 3:30 or 4 p.m. Pacific time. That'd be 6:30 or 7 p.m. Eastern time. And God, I have no idea what that is, UTC. 12 plus 3.5 is 15.5 plus 22:30 UTC or something like that. You tune in live if you can. We appreciate it. I'd certainly pay attention to the chat room, especially when it's a topic like this that I don't know anything about. But you can also get any of the shows after the fact, on-demand audio and video, available at the website, twit.tv/TRI. Best thing to do, subscribe so you get every episode. It's on iTunes, everywhere podcasts are. Triangulation. Thanks to our producer, Karsten Bondi, who's always booking us interesting people. To my technical producer, John Slanina, running the board back there. Thanks to you for being here. I'll see you no, I won't see you next week. So for the next 3 weeks, I'm on vacation. But Sarah's going to do one, right? Tom's going to do one. Is that right? Ayaz is going to do one. Is that how we're going to do it? Yep. Do we know who the guests will be?
Yes. Next week, Sarah Lane will be interviewing Ariel Waldman.
Oh, how exciting. Sarah Lane, Ariel Waldman next week. That is great. I think Ariel Waldman's a very interesting person, a space hack. Yeah, she's working in citizen space now. Yeah, that's neat. That's next week. We'll see you in 3 weeks on Triangulation.